The Tom Woods Show, episode 1575.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Come on now, folks. If you ain't going to start that side hustle now, then when? Check out my free ebook, 5 Paths to an Online Income, where I take you step by step through 5 things that I do that keep food on the Woods household table and how you can do them too. Check it out at pathstoincome.com. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. Very glad to be joined once again by Frank Buckley, who has been teaching at the law school at George Mason University for over 30 years. And he is the author, most recently, of American Secession, The Looming Threat of a National Breakup. That provocative title naturally got my attention, and it's a very interesting, short book, but it will get you thinking, and I think and hope a lot of people who read it thinking in new and original and refreshing ways. Frank, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
All right. This is a provocative and interesting and important book on so many levels. I mean, for one thing, the fact that I have on the line with me a law professor who speaks with something other than contempt about the compact theory of the Union. No, dare I say, even knows what the compact theory of the Union is an astonishing thing. So that's the first thing. But secondly, the idea of secession, especially for Americans, is just toxic. It's unthinkable. It's not on what I call the 3x5 card of allowable opinion. The New York Times is not permitting us to discuss this, and yet you and I are uppity enough to want to talk about it anyway. The very existence of your book I consider to be a triumph. And then when I opened it up, and I thought to myself, this Frank Buckley character, he would really enjoy talking to Don Livingston. Who's the first person you mention in this book? It's Don Livingston, who's thought about this so deeply. So I knew for a fact I was going to enjoy this thing. So let's set the stage here and talk about how you would take the average person who has never contemplated something like this and get that person to think this is not such a crazy idea after all, that maybe it is the one remaining humane solution to what seems to be an intractable problem.
Well, I found it a lot of fun to write the book, and it seemed to me that it made a whole lot of sense. First of all, you refer to the compact theory. That's a theory about how the states entering the Union in 1787 and 88 and 89, when they ratified the Constitution, did so as separate sovereign entities who retained the right to exit from the Union if they so wanted. And that made perfect sense for a lot of reasons. So here's one of them. In the Virginia ratifying Constitution, James Madison said, look, we have nothing to worry about because if we don't like the way it works out, we can leave. And the ratifying convention in Virginia expressly reserved the right to exit the Union. And yet here in Virginia, when Virginia exercised that option, my city of Alexandria was occupied by federal troops, and that wasn't right.
And incidentally, the evidence for the compact theory of the Union, from which secession does seem to follow, and in fact, I think there's a lot of evidence for it. The argument has been made at length by people that nobody's heard of. Like we've heard of Joseph Story and people in the nationalist tradition, but not many people have heard of St. George Tucker or Abel Upshur, who wrote a full-length response to Joseph Story. We never heard any of that, but when you read them, I find their arguments to be really compelling, and yet that's not even really, even though you're a law professor, the angle I want to take in our conversation, simply because folks who listen to me have heard this stuff coming from my mouth quite a bit. What interests me a lot more is how you make the case apart from the Constitution. I mean, because we could get to that. If it came to that, we could sit down and come to some understanding among the states and the federal government and figure out how it would all work. But I want to know, strictly speaking, what the advantages to this would be. Because I think people think that being a great big country is like a self-justifying goal. They just assume that the best way to live is in this giant country. And they think of it almost as being a sacred thing, that it's a kind of blasphemy even to contemplate any form of division. And to get people thinking in this way, And even to propose there are advantages to living on a smaller scale, that's what I find most interesting. So you attack this on a number of grounds. I don't know that I'm totally convinced by the happiness literature, but I do think it's more than plausible to suppose that, for example, if things were on a smaller scale, I think it is the case that there's less possibility of corruption.
Well, listen, let's talk about who the possible secessionists might be if it came to it.
Yeah.
On the conservative side, they might include the Philip Hamburger types who say we live in a regulatory state which is lawless. And the regulatory state is based on the Code of Federal Regulations, i.e., it's federal regulations that bother them. So secession would mean deregulation in the same way that Brexit in Britain means deregulation and an escape from the crazy rules of Brussels. That's number one. Number two, there are people like Peter Schweitzer who rail at the corruption of American politics. And what they're thinking about is not just the Clintons. What they're thinking about is the insiders in D.C., the lobbyists, the people who really behind the scenes create the rules we live by. So, we'd have a less corrupt government when government is closer to the people as it would be in a smaller country. So, I did some number crunching and I found things like smaller countries are less corrupt. And there's nothing surprising about that. I mean, that was a 18th century debate, what the right size of a state. And Montesquieu and the majority of people at the convention in 1787 that gave their constitutions, small is beautiful, roughly, right? Roger Sherman said expressly, smaller countries are happier countries. He said, that's what I've always heard. And I think that's what the evidence is. So you look across the world at countries that seem to be doing well, and what you're looking at are the Denmarks of the world, right? Not the Soviet Unions, not even the Russias. So, just about every country in the world is staring down a secession movement. I don't know why we're the exception.
Again, I wonder if it's because of the unique history of the United States, because of the Civil War. For one thing, people associate secession with violence, or they think that secession is somehow inherently violent, or that it's un-American, because I think Americans do think of the system today that emerged out of Lincoln as really being America. I mean, that war was fought to save the Union. So how could we let people spill all that blood and then tear the Union asunder?
Well, let's talk first of all about the possibility of violence. And, the war was fought in 1861. And I think to the extent it suppressed slavery, it was well fought. Of course, nobody in 1861 said this was about slavery, right? The most abolitionist types in the Republican administration, William Seward and Abraham Lincoln, were prepared to concede an amendment which would guarantee the right of slavery permanently in the Constitution. No country in the world better protects slavery. So 1861 is not about slavery. That happened later. But violence? No, I don't think that would happen. And let me explain. I lived in Quebec, where we had a secession crisis, which nearly won in 1995. And what got things going for the English speakers was a Quebec separatist legislation called Bill 101. And 101 basically suppressed the English language. It was very anti-liberal. And the Anglos called it Bill 401. Why 401? 401 is the name of the highway between Montreal and Toronto. So about 300,000 English speakers in Montreal just up and moved. And we're seeing that right now. I mean, people are moving from Illinois or California to Texas. That would simply accelerate all this. So we wouldn't see a war, but the U-Haul company would make out like bandits. As for your second point about pride in America, you really touch on something important. I don't think this is about kind of, because we're not going to undo the civil rights revolution. On the other hand, Americans take a certain amount of glory in being members of the strongest country in the world. And my point only is that kind of glory comes at a cost, right? A cost in terms of lives lost in places where we didn't belong, like Iraq. And also a cost in terms of the military budget, which is bigger than the next 21 countries put together, right? So, our national defense is not really at issue here. We're more like we were when Washington gave his farewell address and said, here we are in North America. We're so lucky. We're not in Europe. They fight wars all the time. We're protected by oceans. So, we don't need a strong military for that reason. But we grew a strong military, and with it, we grew imperialistic ambitions, which gave us the Second Gulf War, for example. And we repudiated that as voters in 2006 and in 2016. So, Americans aren't necessarily happy with being the country with all the guns in the room. We have that sense of glory, but we're also paying for it. And supposing this time it were California that wanted out, and the message to California on a secession referendum is, if you didn't have to pay your share of the military budget, that would be enough to fund Medicare in California, national health in California. Okay, well, I think a lot of people in California, the non-militaristic types especially, would think that a good bargain.
I would hope so. I would think so. And yet the trouble is, and maybe I'm generalizing too much, it seems to me that I can at least find a tradition within American conservatism that really is concerned about finite things like hearth and home and my community, and they're not really interested in propagandizing leftists living in San Francisco. They want to care for their own homes, whereas I find that the progressive left tends to be more imperialistic in their ambitions for social reconstruction. And it's not enough for them to say, we'll live our way and be content. It's we'll live our way and so will you. And we're going to ram it down your throats. And so secession to them would seem like an abandonment of their proselytizing mission to spread progressivism across the country. That's what I fear.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, except for one thing. In 1992, Irving Kristol said the culture wars are over, the left won, but the left, which had been up to that point, right? If there are rights, they have to be rights across the country to whatever, same-sex marriage, transgender bathrooms, whatever you want, right? The cultural imperialism took a hit in 2016 when the left realized maybe we didn't quite win the culture wars. So imagine what things would be like in an easily imagined future where impeachment is fizzled out, where Trump wins re-election, and where 2 or 3 more conservatives are appointed to the Supreme Court. And at that point, I think the left would go ballistic. I mean, you see, in 2016, to understand the craziness of our politics in the last 3 years, I think you have to understand that the left took a psychic wound. It thought it had property rights in American thinking and American culture. And it realized, hey, this is being contested. And when they realize it's more than contested, but that they might lose, then their cultural imperialism will dwindle and they might start thinking seriously about secession. I mean, if secession happens in the next 5 years, it'll be from places like Washington State or California. In short, this time around, it's going to be politically correct.
Well, that's an interesting possibility. I definitely don't rule that out. My thinking is they would stick it out knowing that the demographics seem to be on their side. There seems to be an inevitable, I hate to say inevitable because nothing is strictly inevitable, blue shift in the country. I mean, there are a lot of indicators suggesting that the country, either because of immigration or because the younger folks have much more left-wing views, and as they get older, I mean, sometimes they switch from left to right. I get that. But it does look like there's a trend toward the blue. So they may say, all right, we have to grit our teeth for 4 more years, but then the future is ours. I mean, Texas, Florida go out of contention for the Republican Party, and we're going to win.
Well, I know I've heard that a fair bit myself. I mean, people will finally, in argument, sit back smugly and talk about what you're talking about. And you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of the moment in the movie Cabaret where this young kid starts singing, "The future belongs to me." Turns out he's a Nazi. These guys basically do have fascist-like ambitions to rule over other people. Maybe they'll think eventually that'll happen. And the question really goes back to whether one side has lost the culture war or not. So, it may well be that the resistance to all the things that the left comes up with, which are more and more extreme, right? I mean, these guys don't have a stop impulse, right? They don't know when enough is enough. And that's because they're driven by an ideology where they've got rightness on their side and the enemy is the devil. I mean, Orange Man is bad. So it's precisely their extremism as expressed by people like Bernie Sanders or Liz Warren that would prove their undoing. And if they're not willing to compromise on that, I mean, they'd have a choice at that point. Either we realize that, we're not going to go communist, and we're going to have to compromise, or they'll start thinking, let's have the perfectly woke state of California do whatever we want.
Well, we'll see. We'll definitely see, because I don't know where 2020 is going to go, but I think it looks better for Trump than I thought it would maybe even a year ago. But let's pause for a quick break and then come right back. Folks, let me tell you about my secret weapon for learning new things and getting ahead. I recommend a lot of books on this show, and you all wonder how you're ever going to get to all of them. And one of the ways you do that is through an app called Blinkist. It works on your phone, your tablet, your web browser, takes the best key takeaways, the need-to-know information from thousands of nonfiction books, and condenses them down into just 15 minutes that you can read or listen to. It's super effective and super efficient. I've enjoyed the 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss, thanks to Blinkist. And I was delighted to find The Bitcoin Standard by Saifedean Ammous on here. We've interviewed him, as well as an old classic like Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman. With Blinkist, you get unlimited access to read or listen to a massive library of condensed nonfiction books, all the books you want, and all for one low price. Right now, for a limited time, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Go to Blinkist.com/Woods, try it free for 7 days, and save 25% off your new subscription. That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist, Blinkist.com/Woods to start your free 7-day trial. And you'll also save 25% off, but only when you sign up at Blinkist.com/Woods. One of the problems, I think, with having this discussion in the first place is not enough Americans have the view of the Union that I think Thomas Jefferson had, where he looked at it, he cherished it, but he viewed it as a utilitarian thing to be judged by its results. If it didn't work out, then we'd try something else. Maybe we have 3 confederations. Well, whatever. I mean, there's no note from heaven that says this is the square footage of the United States and not 1 inch of it shall be changed. That's not the way he thought of it. But I think most people do think of it as something sacred, so that makes it impossible to have a rational discussion about it. The second thing I want to point out is that it is such an obviously humane thing to say we have a lot of people in this country and we have a radical divide in terms of worldviews and likes and dislikes and preferences and commitments and ideologies, and to think that the only possible approach for us to live near each other is for there to be one city that hands down infallible judgments that are to be followed by everyone is bizarre to me. And yet that is what everyone takes for granted. I consider that to be the most inhumane system. And yet if you propose that, well, what if we each said, look, you do your thing and I'll do mine, that's considered to be crazy talk. I mean, that goes to show how narrow the range of allowable opinion in the U.S. is. Here you have at least something that, at the very least, even if you reject the idea, is at least obviously worthy of consideration, and it's not even on the table.
Well, and that's precisely what I end up proposing. I mean, what I wasn't doing was making a brief for secession. What I said rather was, firstly, secession is quite possible. And secondly, given that it's possible, maybe we need to rethink our extreme positions. Maybe in particular, the left, which wants to dictate the terms by which we all live, needs to back up a little bit and concentrate only on, ruling New York City and messing that up as well they will. And the other thing is this: supposing there were a secession referendum in a place like California, and suppose that it's backed up by a state declaration of independence, that by itself wouldn't make California independent. That would be by way of just starting a conversation. For example, California couldn't simply secede without discussions about how to bear its share of the national debt. And there'd be all sorts of related questions like free movement of goods and people, would we need a passport to visit Disneyland, that kind of stuff. So all of that would be on the table. I mean, secession would have to be accomplished by an agreement with the rest of the states and through something like a constitutional convention. And what that might give us is a solution to our problems in terms of a greatly renewed kind of federalism, which I call home rule. And I think that's what, the Supreme Court would inevitably get involved in all of this. And if the Supreme Court had a look at this, number one, I think the originalists on the court would take another look at the compact theory and say, the framers at the convention, all of them conceded a right of secession, pretty much. So the originalists would have to say, we have to pay attention to this. And number two, the more political members of the Supreme Court, particularly if the move came from a liberal state that wanted out, the more liberal members of the court would have to decide between an abstract right to a perpetual union and the idea that secession's a nullity on the one hand, versus do we want to empower the president to send in the troops? Okay, and I'm kind of thinking that we wouldn't see the latter. See, the Supreme Court at one point in 1868 ruled that secession was constitutionally impossible, but that was after the war was good and over. And it'd be different if you had to look at it prospectively when secession passed. And at that point, you really could get violence if the troops are sent in. And, finally, my prediction is that if any of this happened, what we wouldn't see would be an Abraham Lincoln in office. What we would see would be somebody more like a James Buchanan. James Buchanan, in his last State of the Union message in 1860, said, look, I don't get it. We're prosperous. We're doing well as a country. You Southerners have everything you want in terms of slavery, and you have no right to secede. Okay, so there it is. But what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to send in the troops? I don't think I should be invading. I don't think the Feds should be invading the state. By the way, neither did James Madison. Okay, so I think both because of our reflections on what the founders of our country were all about when they gave us our Constitution, and because concerns about the preference to, talking about the issues rather than fighting over them, I think we'd see a recognition that an accommodation would have to be made for a state that wanted out. And the most likely accommodation would be something I call home rule, which would be kind of federalism on steroids, basically. And that would involve not merely a right on the part of the states to opt out of federal laws, but also, a lot of the newly created rights that the Supreme Court has given us, like same-sex marriage or abortion.
Well, let's wrap up today by examining that with particular emphasis on what some listeners will think is the elephant in the room, which is civil rights. Because the idea of local control and home rule has been tainted by the fact that some, not all, of the American history of states' rights has involved violations of the rights of particular individuals, especially Black Americans. Now, if you look at the whole history of the U.S., we see states' rights and nullification being used to defend the freedom of speech, to defend against unreasonable searches and seizures at the time of the Jefferson embargo. We had Daniel Webster threatening to interpose if there was an attempt to conscript troops for the War of 1812. I mean, you see all kinds of examples of it. And we even see the Wisconsin State Supreme Court citing the Kentucky resolutions of 1798 and 99 and saying that we could nullify the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So there's a huge history Americans don't know. But still, there is this history. If you look around the world at large centralized states, they haven't been particularly good to the minorities within their borders. I mean, we can think of very spectacular examples of this. And then examples like, as an Armenian, I wouldn't say the Armenians fared too well in the Ottoman Empire. So it's quaintly naive to think that large centralized states will protect minorities. But we do still have this part of American history. And how does somebody advocating for radical decentralization reckon with that?
Well, my answer is that we're not the same country we were in 1861 or even in the 1890s. The civil rights revolution has taken hold, and it's not going to be undone whatever happens, right? When I speak of the civil rights revolution, of course, what I'm referring to is the rights of African Americans, as reflected in things like the Civil Rights Bill of 1964. we're not going to undo that, but the rights revolution more recently includes all sorts of contested rights, like, I mentioned same-sex marriage and abortion and things like that, would be more in play, right? I mean, for one thing, African Americans are spread across the country, and we're not going to change any of that, and nobody's proposing it. Nobody wants it, apart from, absolutely extreme lunatic fringe, which counts for nothing, basically. So, the stakes are a lot lower than people think they are, right? I mean, we don't have to go around pretending, as the left does, that everybody who disagrees with you is a fascist and a racist and all that. That's not who we are. We're still Americans in that sense. So that wouldn't change. But the more recent excesses of the rights revolution, as expressed in Supreme Court opinions, those would be more on the table.
Okay, so in general, then, again, as we try and wrap this up, because I want people to read your book, because the fact that this book exists heartens me so much because it needs to be written. And as I say, particularly by a law professor, this is highly unusual, and you don't need me to tell you that. The case we're basically making here is a case that's been made on my program a number of times before, that you could go to both the left and the right and say, right now, both of you are frustrated and you don't get the kinds of things you want. Well, you're never going to get everything you want. But under this arrangement that we're proposing, you could get a lot of it. You get a lot of what you want right now. You don't have to wait 50 years to transform the Supreme Court or to persuade 150 million fellow Americans to join you. You could get a lot of what you want right now by just abandoning this imperial plan of trying to rule over everybody. You could have everything, or at least a good chunk of what you want right now. Is that basically the message?
That's the message, and the message is that's what democracy means, right? I mean, democracy means self-rule. It doesn't mean rule by some appointed judges, and it doesn't even mean rule by a Congress elected by deeply split American people.
So let me just ask you this. What do you think the prospects for this really are? I think the case for it is strong, but you are up against a real deep-seated opposition to this way of thinking, which may, as you say, be breaking down. But what are the legitimate prospects for this? Well,
right now, we're just on the cusp of thinking about these things. You hear people saying, boy, we've never been more divided since 1865. There's basic disagreement about the most fundamental aspects of government, and there may be a civil war. And my answer is no, there's not going to be a civil war, but there may be political means of curing what divides us. And if we continue to accelerate the left's movement towards imperialistically governing everybody in America, then we're going to see more and more of that. And if the left ever thinks that, there was a culture war and we've just lost it, then the movement would come from the left. And maybe that would be a good thing. That's my argument. And what we're trying to do is predict where we'll be 5 years from now, perhaps. And my book is the opening shot at trying to explain how we might find ourselves 5 years from now in a situation where we're not going to have war, but what we'll find is possibly a left that realizes it's lost the culture war, and without going to violence, it might look for a political solution to what divides us. I say the impetus would come from the left in that case, and it's something that everybody, right and left, would begin to take seriously at that point. So it's not so much a prediction as a hint as to where we might be heading, and it's a first shot at explaining how that would work.
Well, I hope it's widely read and discussed, because that would move the Overton window, so to speak, in for a change, a favorable direction. So the book we've been discussing, American Secession, The Looming Threat of National Breakup. I like that subtitle, but I don't think of it as a threat. I think of it as a promise. Maybe your publisher forced that on you. I don't know, but I welcome it. I welcome this this looming breakup. American Secession, The Looming Threat of National Breakup by our guest Frank Buckley, given as F.H. Buckley on the cover. Thanks so much for your time and best of luck with this.
Tom, thank you so much.
All right, folks, it is January 23rd, 2020 as I record this. And for just a few more days, maybe 5 more days, I've got a way for you to get my Tom Woods email domination program. Yes, I did name it that. I'm very proud of it, by the way. It teaches you how to build and monetize an email list. And that baby sells for 97 smackers, but I am giving it away for $0. All you have to do pretty much to get it is exist. So if you want to know how to get it for $0, head over to tomwoods.com/goodies. Yes, that is an actual page. tomwoods.com/goodies. But you got to hurry up because I'm going to be yanking that down very soon. All right, see you tomorrow, everybody.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.